Welcome to Afrocentricity. Hi, I am your host, Michael Washington, and today's program is part two of our symposium on white privilege laws and white supremacy laws. Today, we will explore ideas on the topic of education as a human right. In addition to specifically addressing this point, the panel will also address the current attacks on the teaching of history and their connections to new white privilege laws and white supremacy laws. The moderator of our forum today is internationally known as an artist, a poet, a community organizer, and human rights activist. As a human rights activist, he has presented cases of human rights abuses before the Human Rights Committee of the United Nations in both New York and Geneva, Switzerland. His advocacy for human rights is exemplified in this panel discussion and is a part of his mission to educate the public about our human rights. Now, to introduce our distinguished panel, I present our moderator, Daniel Buford.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. We're all concerned about human rights, but if we don't know what our human rights are, it becomes difficult to advocate for anyone's human rights or even know when those human rights are being violated. And we need to know that. Now, most people kind of know what their civil rights are. And let me just break down real quickly that our civil rights are those rights that we as U.S. citizens have as a result of being citizens. These are the citizenship rights that are guaranteed to us under the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and all the subsequent amendments. So then that's where we get our civil rights that protect us in terms of rights of free speech, religion, freedom of assembly, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, etc. Now, we also have human rights. And some of the civil rights that we have coincide with human rights, but the rationale for them comes from a different place, a different document. So the rationale for our human rights comes from the document that founded the United Nations in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And from out of that Human Rights Declaration, the various human rights treaties that the United States and other countries signed on to, those come under the various amendments of that first document that gave birth to the United Nations. So then we are here dealing with the implications of human rights with respect to education. Is education a human right? Should it be a human right? If it is a human right, then what difference does that make? So then the first part of our discussion is going to be looking at that subject, the topic of education in and of itself as being a human right. And we might even want to throw in there, since we have educators, should human rights, the human rights of people, be taught? Should people know what their human rights are? So then with that, I want to introduce our distinguished panelists. We have Dr. Ken Tankersley, who is an archaeologist, and he works at the University of Cincinnati. We have Dr. Michael Washington, who is a historian who works here at Northern Kentucky University. We have Kelly Germain, who is in North Carolina and does therapy work. We have respondents on the line. We have Reverend David Billings, the author of the book Deep Denial. He's on the line with us. We have Mr. Reginald Lyles, who is also a retired police captain. He's on the line from California. And then we have my good friend, Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb, on the line, also speaking to us from the Bay Area of California. So, Dr. Tankersley, could you go first on that question about, is education a human right? Should it be, and does it make any difference?
Absolutely, Daniel. And I'll use your comments as a segue. What I'd like to first point out is Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone has a right to education. Education shall be free. Education shall be directed to the full development of human personality and to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Now, what that means in essence is the right to education is, as Daniel pointed out, a human right, and it's indispensable in the exercise of other human rights. Quality education aims to ensure the development of a fully rounded human being. Education is one of the most powerful tools in lifting socially excluded children and adults out of poverty and into society. Education narrows the gender gap. For education as a human right to work, there must be equality of opportunity, universal access, and enforceable and monitored quality of standards. The human right to education can only be enjoyed if accompanied by academic freedom. As a tenured professor at the University of Cincinnati, I am more than a little concerned at the GOP's current essentially restrictions on our freedom in academia. Academic freedom is the liberty of members of the academic community to pursue, to develop, and transmit knowledge and ideas through research, teaching, study, discussion, documentation, production, and creation of writing. Academic freedom requires autonomy of all higher education institutions. Educational freedom is guaranteed in both our international, national, and regional human rights treaties. We really must recognize the right of everyone to education. Education is directed to the full development of the human personality and the sense of dignity. And it shall be strengthened and with the respect for human rights as fundamental freedoms. Education enables all persons to participate effectively in a free society, promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations and all racial and ethnic and religious groups. A critical aspect is critical race theory. We must remember that race is not a biologically grounded feature of human beings. It's socially constructed. It's culturally invented. It's a category that has been used and is currently used to oppress and exploit indigenous people around the world. Legal institutions in the United States have inherently created, maintained social, economic, and political inequalities between people defined as whites and non-whites, especially African Americans, Native Americans, Latinx, and Asian Americans. For Native Americans, from the arrival of Europeans, education has systematically denied Native American identity. Historically, the United States has denied Native Americans the right and ability to educate their own tribal members. America has always used schools as a weapon against Native Americans and African Americans. Education has been used as a tactic to destroy Native American and African American identity, to destroy culture, erase indigenous languages, to dismantle religion and ritual, and to break apart families. Freedom of education has the potential, however, to revive and protect Native and African American cultural identity. As Martin Luther King said, the function of education is to teach one to think intensively and to think critically. Intelligence plus character. That is the true goal of education. And I'll leave, I don't want to suck up a lot of time, but I'd like to quote Malcolm X. Education is our passport to the future, for tomorrow belongs to the people who prepare for it today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tankersley. Dr. Michael Washington, Northern Kentucky University. Education. Is education a human right? Should it be? And if it is, what difference does it make?
My ideas on the topic of education as a human right. At the moment, my ideas about education as a human right can be summarized into two brief points. One, that it is a right for humans to be educated. And two, that it is the responsibility of humans to educate. Far too often, Black people entrust this responsibility to the state and are invariably surprised by the low consistency, the consistency of their low achievement, which is predictable. The verification that the state is doing its job. Rights of humans to be educated. Now, why do I say that it is a right for humans to be educated? My ideal is that people of color, and in my case, Black people, should be concerned about their public officials' awareness and interpretation of Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that declares that the states must provide education to their citizens. I would submit that most state officials are not even aware of this important, universally recognized document that incidentally was co-authored by Eleanor Roosevelt and others. Unfortunately, many of those who are aware that education is a human right, more often than not, tend to view education as a mere function of the state rather than as a vehicle to facilitate the full development of the human personality and the strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. This is a critical concern because education provided by the state must by necessity be provided in the interest of maintaining peace as defined by the state and not by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. From the state's perspective, law and order equals peace. For instance, it must be remembered that for more than half of the 20th century, the states defined peace in ways that maintained Jim Crow segregation. From this standpoint, society was peaceful as long as the segregated Negroes accepted and normalized their legal inferiority and their social exclusion. Society became unpeaceful, even disordered, when the law could not constrain the determination of the Black community's undaunted quest to be treated as human beings, worthy of equitable treatment and justice. This disorder means to state officials that there is an absence of peace, so that from the state standpoint, peace may be achieved through the effective facilitation and implementation of unjust policies and practices. You must not forget that Jim Crow was established legally for the specific purpose of maintaining and perpetuating injustice. After leaving this session, take a look around and you will discover that the United States society remains segregated, despite the Brown decision of 1954 that legally desegregated the schools, and the civil rights movement that led to various acts of Congress. Not only have these acts not become laws, but they have fallen short on granting all citizens full citizenship, voting rights, and the right to affordable and decent housing. Peace, as defined by the state, must, under no circumstances, disrupt this legally sanctioned social arrangement. Otherwise, there will be disorder, even chaos. From this vantage point, a peaceful society is one that effectively prevents challenges to the racially segregated social order so that people, especially black people, and people of color, especially black people, remain in their segregated place. Therefore, the education provided by the state should not be expected to be a source of human empowerment, but rather an important instrument of social control. On the other hand, peace, as defined by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, assumes that everyone has the right to not be subjected to degrading treatment. This is stipulated distinctively in Article 5. In addition, according to Article 1 of the document, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. From this standpoint, it is impossible to attain peace within a racially segregated society that degrades people on the basis of race. One important lesson that we can take from this is that while it is the right of humans to be educated, that both the content and the process of the education they receive may be a detriment to achieving a peaceful, democratic society. Most of the educational professionals responsible for teaching our children have very little, if any, background in black studies, or for that matter, the study of any ethnic group. Therefore, even if educators wanted to provide a culturally relevant and empowering educational format for students of color, they would not have the training to do so. This brings me to my second point, that is, that it is the responsibility of humans and not just the state to educate. For those who define themselves as anti-racist, the university curriculum must once again become an important focal point of their activity. They must pick up on the campus organizing that was left off during the generation of their parents and grandparents of the 1960s, the generation that brought into existence black and ethnic studies programs and departments on college campuses across the nation. The task of anti-racists are not just to organize local, regional, and national constituencies to protest the lack of ethnic inclusion in the curriculum, but to actively participate in creating partnerships with colleges and universities that will permit them to collaborate in administering existing programs as well as designing new initiatives. They must develop a thorough appreciation for Article 27, Item 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that states everyone has the right to freely participate in the cultural life of the community. And Article 29, Item 1 goes even further than that. And it says that the right to participate in community, asserting that everyone has duties to the community. With these articles in mind, anti-racist constituents must work as allies with black college students and other students of color to hold predominantly white colleges and universities accountable for offering black and ethnic studies programs that prepare students with the academic training and the research skills to close the gaps in education and health care and to create effective community-based models of police accountability. A relevant Black Studies curriculum should be one that empowers students to leave college not just with a degree, but with the consciousness and the competence to organize educational programs in black churches and other religious and community-based institutions. Since the aim of this type of community-based curriculum is to increase black high school and college graduation rates and to develop community-based leadership within the cultural leadership with the cultural knowledge and technical skills to create police accountability initiatives. It is the responsibility of humans and not the state to engage in these types of transformative interactions.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. Our next panelist is Kelly Germain, who is doing a lot of work in terms of healing the effects of racism through her therapy work. Kelly, we're so glad that you could be with us today. And what are your thoughts on the question of, is education a human right? Should it be a human right? And what difference does it make if it is a human right?
Thank you so much, Reverend Buford and Dr. Tankersley, Dr. Washington, for your thoughts so far. It feels really fitting that we're talking about this today. I had a friend on Instagram send me a post that the Howard Zinn Education Project posted today, that on August 10th in 1835, nearly 500 white men destroyed an integrated school in Canaan, New Hampshire. And just we've also been sitting in some white caucus spaces with some different white anti-racist movement ancestors and what we can learn from their stories. One of them is Prudence Crandall. And just sitting with the legacy of what does it mean to be white and reckon with the profound attempt by white supremacy and colonialism to underserve, miseducate, particularly people of color, but also white people like myself. And so I've just been sitting with this one quote from the comedian George Carlin as I think about what a right is. And George Carlin said, "Rights aren't rights if someone can take them away. They're temporary privileges. And it seems that the list gets shorter and shorter each year." And so I'm thinking about, well, if it's just a temporary privilege and not all of us have been allowed to be educated throughout history in this pyramid scheme we're in, well, then what does it mean for it to be a right, and how do we make it a right and hold it as a right? I've also just been sitting with, like, what does the word and the concept of education mean to me? And it brought me back to some organizing in Cincinnati. There was a teach-in that Black Lives Matter Cincinnati did called Unchain Our Children. And we brought the community together across race to just ask 4 simple questions. One of them was, what are schools supposed to do? The second question was, what is the purpose of education? The third was, what are our schools doing right now, and how are children experiencing schools? And when we took the first 2 questions of, like, well, what are they supposed to do, and juxtapose that with what are they doing right now, and how are children experiencing them, it was like completely different answers. No matter how many times we did the teach-in, it was always completely different answers. And what I would hear from particularly students of color was just how horribly policed they are, how much they're spending not in school because they're having all these suspensions because of the school to prison pipeline, and all of the horrific things that they've experienced inside of schools. And then I also thought about my own experience as a white student in Ohio. So I went to one of the quote better schools in the state of Ohio, in the town of Hudson. My parents said they moved there because it was the best school district in the state. And by all certain standards, I had access to a lot of things that students of color didn't. As a white person, and a class privileged person, I had access to, like, computers and internet and all these different things. And so it felt like I was getting educated. But then at that teach-in that we did, we sat with this definition of education from a Brazilian educator named Paulo Freire. And he said that education either functions as an instrument to bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom. And so when I even examined my own privileged white education that allowed me to climb the pyramid and become someone who got their master's and and feel relatively economically comfortable within the United States, I still reckon with the fact that my education never taught me mostly to practice freedom. In fact, it was only certain educators, often educators of color, who taught me to practice freedom. And so I'm sitting with all of that. I'm also sitting with how much I've continued to look at the international data on how even like the US is doing educationally. And I looked up today, just Pew Research Center, like, where are we at? And it was like, in mathematics, it's like, you have to scroll all the way through 40 different countries just to get to the US, where we land. And that it's just so interesting that we think we're so exceptional, and yet that's where our things are. Maybe the last thing I'll close with is just my industry of mental health. Mostly my training hasn't served me in figuring out how to be a liberatory therapeutic presence. But one of the things that has served me is the framework of liberation psychology, which was formulated in Latin America, particularly by a man named Ignacio Martín Baró. And one of the things that liberation psychology says is that it's really important for people's mental health that they have education about their socio-political context that allows them to become social actors in their own life. And I think about every time I was in therapy with particularly children of color that I would work with in Durham, North Carolina, who would be sent to me because they were like struggling with self-esteem or suicidality or PTSD, and almost none of the tools that my fancy education gave me would help them. But when we started talking about some of the things that I started learning from particularly Black educators within the system, like about their socio-political context, where it's like, well, okay, what's causing your suicidality? Well, I'm getting bullied by these white students because they say that my people are lazy and that we're illegal for being here. And it's like, well, let's examine that. And like, let's talk about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and how your people have worked very hard, how this land was stolen from them. And that actually was an indicator of them being able to have better mental health outcomes, to understand their socio-political context. And so I just think that as a therapist, I think education is a human right. I'm curious how we can actually enact it that way, and that I think that will have really profound mental health benefits for all of us if we're diligent about that. So thank you.
Thank you for those thoughtful comments, Kelly. And you mentioned the name of Paulo Freire. And on our last phone call, we had Dr. Ron Glass. I actually met Paulo Freire in the home of Ron Glass in Berkeley, California. And this is in the very early days of the People's Institute. I was actually able to share with him what we were doing with the curriculum as we were putting it together back then, how we were using his work to frame our own work in terms of how we were designing the workshop curriculum, the questions used, the types of self-discoveries that we were trying to lead people through in terms of the power analysis that we had been taught by Jim Dunn and so on. So Paulo Freire's book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, is certainly a classic book and one well worth reading in the 21st century. Now, we have a few more people that are going to hold forth on this general comment. They won't be presenting quite as long, but they will be responding to what they have heard thus far. And the first of those respondents is Reverend David Billings. The next would be Reginald Lyles, and then the last one will be Rabbi Lynn Gottlieb.
Well, thanks everybody that has shared, and I really appreciate it. I don't think I was educated at all until I met organizers who were intending to move this country towards equity and were using history understood in a different way than I had been taught. And the whole role of culture as the lifeblood of community. I'd never heard any of these concepts. I had never heard history taught until I met some of the people on this screen, Dr. Washington, Daniel Buford, Barbara Major, continue to be great influences on me. And I used to take, after hearing them speak, I would go back to those historians, all white, who were seen as the most powerful or informed, and I would have to learn how to read between the lines. And I think that's one of the teachings that those teachers of color and anti-racist whites, I had never heard this kind of language. I had never seen people called white and persons of color, indigenous and Black, teach. I had never had a teacher other than white teachers. And some were very good, very well-meaning, but almost universally ill-informed. And I don't blame them for that. That was the intent. I remember teaching at NYU for a while at the School of Social Work, and I asked the faculty, why don't you teach about race? And they said, we don't know how to teach about race. I said, but all your students are going to be employed for the most part in communities of color. So it's always fascinated me of how one can advance in the colonized educational system of white supremacy and never be exposed to understandings and definitions that are liberatory where race is concerned. I remember, and I think it was Barbara Major, but it might have been Dr. Mike or Reverend Dan, who said to me once, the Black community is at its healthiest, mentally speaking, when it is organizing for their liberation, for its liberation. I remember John Moran, Anishinaabe elder. I was older than he, but he was much wiser. And he said, there's no such thing as an individual Anishinaabe. I had never heard such language. It was incredibly inspiring. No such thing. Growing up and being educated as a white person, my individuality was always stressed. But in John Moran's and in all of the Black teachers that I've had, not all of whom have been in academia, some have, but most have been organizers in community, and that liberation was tied to organizing. These concepts, these new things, those of you on this screen are rarely exposed to the genius that has not yet been published, that has not yet been academically anointed to teach at one of the universities. So I continue to keep my teachers in mind and realize that to the degree that wisdom has been shared with me, it has been shared with those who are working to organize their communities, and some of whom have the opportunity to teach in higher education, but most are in community or organizing around liberation struggles. So, I appreciate all of you and continue to learn from all of you. And, those are my reactions. No specific questions, although the statement that the difference between civil rights and human rights are fascinating to me, because for most of this nation's history, prior to its constitution and for 100 or more years afterwards, people of color were not considered human beings. Thus, they would have no human rights under the Constitution or other legitimized and sanctioned educational processes. So thank each of you for that which you've shared today.
Thank you, Reverend Dillon. Next, we have Mr. Reginald Lyles coming to us from California.
Coming from a state where there's very little water, so pray for us. I want to thank the presenters. I was especially moved by Dr. Mike's comments in regards to the purpose and the result of the state's education versus the purpose and the result of the individual's right to educate themselves, their families, their communities, and that we ought to be very suspicious of the state's education. And we see evidence of that by the dismantling across the United States of Black Studies programs on most campuses, on a lot of campuses. But the thing that jumps out to me the most is the crisis that we're in right now with this COVID and the variant. I'm going to be very personal here. I'm going to use my own family. I have a large family out of Louisiana, and I'm very proud of our achievements educationally. My parents' generation, a few of them were educated. A few went to Savannah State. A few went to Southern, but they made it. They made a point that we had to be educated, and we took that wholeheartedly. We dove into it. Now our children, we passed that on, and we've insisted that they become educated. And by the most part, I'm proud to say, I would say more than 50% have done well educationally, have families and have children of their own. However, here's the miseducation part. We got a crisis going on right now. We're in the middle of a war. We know that over 624,000 deaths from this COVID, more deaths than from World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam combined. We have a new variant out that is more virulent than COVID-19. And where do we have the deaths continuing? Out in my home state, Alabama, in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas, Georgia, dirty Florida. My God, and the leadership of those states have said nothing about encouraging people, the public education of folk, to help themselves, help their children, go get vaccinated, wear a mask, get control of your school boards, and make sure they're doing the right thing about your children coming into schools. Unfortunately, in my state and in Orleans Parish, the devastation of folks being infected with this virus is happening throughout the Black community. And these people are educated. My nephews and nieces are Southern University graduates, LSU graduates. they've watched their parents struggle. They know about the civil rights movements and all of that we went through. But what has happened? They're following, and they probably wouldn't admit this, but they're following those idiots in Fox News and those elected officials who's telling them, oh, you don't have to do that. Don't wear a mask. And they are ending up in the morgue. It's amazing to me. The Louisiana senator just came out today advocating to get vaccinated, and he's a physician, but he's about 2 years too late. So he's no hero of mine. But I'm confused that I would think that my nieces and nephews would know better. But that's this, they've been educated by the state. And they've been miseducated by the state, and it continues. So right now I'm a little depressed because in my family the hospitalization rate has went up because of this COVID, and it's all about being miseducated or not educated, or allowing Facebook to put out these lies. And what is education but a defense against lies? What is education but a pursuit of the truth? And when you have a pursuit of the truth, you have a right to pursue the truth. You have a right to defend yourself from the lies, and defend yourself from exploitations and abuse. It's just a terrible time right now for us, and we just have to call it what it is. You're not erudite if you're talking about Tuskegee and you really don't understand and read enough about Tuskegee. You're not being erudite, and you're not getting the vaccine. And anytime you are following the Trumps of the world, or the DeSantises of the world, or the Ted Cruzes of the world, anytime your thinking and strategy and analysis aligns with them, and you look like me, you need your head examined. You need your head examined. And that's what I think Dr. Mike was alluding to. You have to be able to interpret for yourself. Now, David just said a phrase that I heard early in my home: read between the lines. We had to understand that. We had to practice that. We had to talk and say what we meant, what we didn't mean, and sound like we're saying something else. And you had to have the intellect to determine what we actually were saying. We had to use that as a way to circumvent the oppression of just racism in our society. It's important that we teach our folks how to read between the lines, how we interpret the politics of the day, how we interpret the economics of the day, how we interpret the medical care and housing issues of the day. How are you interpreting it? Are you interpreting that because you hear something, or you read some 50-word statement on Facebook? Are you interpreting it because you heard some idiot on Fox News or on his OAN newscast? Are you reading? Are you reading and researching for yourself? Do you think that's necessary? This is what education is about, to avoid being a victim of miseducation. And I want to thank you all for having me here.
Thank you, Brother Reg. Rabbi Len Gottlieb, my friend, what you got to say, man?
Thank you so much for inviting me into this conversation. My ancestral name, the ancestral name I carry is Miriam. I am the mother of Nathaniel, the grandmother, the new grandma of Lila Sivan. I am the daughter of Sivia, the daughter of Bessie, the daughter of Delia, the daughter of Jenny, the daughter of Henrietta, who herself is buried in Lehigh Land in the east coast of Turtle Island. I am she, her, and I'm sitting on Ohlone land. And I follow this protocol of introduction, first of all, to acknowledge my positionality, where I come from. And that I think that's important. Partly what we're saying is that education at its root has to be liberatory. And I learned this and would like to thank this from my ancestors, whose, Jewish people have also been, throughout our history, been criminalized, been denied, been erased, experienced genocide. And so we view education as not just a human right, but a key to our survival, our very survival. And I believe that education for people who are consistently criminalized, denied, neglected, and objectified, and considered to be disposable human beings, to be used up by white supremacy and patriarchy, to be used up by capitalism. Education is about remembering our human dignity. So I was very moved by what Dr. Washington said, and focusing on the need for human dignity and for, at its very heart, in this context of being not seen as a full human being by white supremacist lineages, that one has to have as a core value how to flip the script. It's reading between the lines, yes, but also flipping the script completely, because the script, the normative script, internalizes, makes people who don't fit into the category of white supremacy, internalize self-hatred, internalize a sense of not being enough. And so one has to flip that script and say, Adaraba, that's a Talmudic phrase. Actually, it's the opposite. Where does the wisdom live? Where does the resiliency live? Where does the brilliance live? It lives in the heart of people who are struggling for liberation, because that is the basic human inner desire. It's how we are born. We are born to be free. And if people are socially organized to take that away, then that is the first thing that must be challenged. And so for the United States of America, reparations, the need for reparations has to be front and center. And reparations means the restoration of education as a human right, as a human right, with equity in the distribution of resources, with centering the narratives and stories of people who have been brutalized by systemic violence. And that is really the only way. It's in the context, reparations has to be in the context of atonement, because unless we understand that that the United States has committed robbery, theft, and genocide at its core, then our relationships cannot be repaired without creating a culture of repair. And I owe this phrase to Dr. Dave Ragland of the Grassroots Reparation Campaign. I'm on the organizing team there. And also to Interfaith Movement for Human Integrity in California, which both organizations, which are led by people of color and based on critical race theory, and whose core values is to first understand the root causes of harm. That is our educational need right now. And finally, I'd just like to express my condolences to the families of almost 700,000 people, the survivors of so much loss. My heart goes to you, and I know that we as a nation have failed our educational responsibilities, and hopefully through our intersectionality and our passion for human life and for each other, we can overcome racism in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for responding to that first question, or the first set of questions that had to do with, is education a right, a human right, and what does that mean to look at that? And all of our panelists have turned that topic inside out and looked at it from different angles. Both Dr. Tankersley and Dr. Washington cited the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and particular articles there that not only guarantee academic freedom and human rights through education, but also human dignity, which cannot be understated, because the education has been cited by previous speakers and our respondents, can not only be education, it can be miseducation, as was referred to by Dr. Carter G. Woodson in his classic book, The Miseducation of the Negro. In Greek history, there's a historian whose name I'm definitely going to butcher, but I think it's Thucydides or Thucydides. Thucydides, he's a historian, father historian in a different way than Herodotus, because he was a father of a particular type of exegesis and interpretation of history. And with the histories prior to Thucydides, the histories were basically written from the top down. That is, say, it was written from the standpoint of the aristocracy, the elite, the monarchy, the kings, the pharaohs, the people who are in charge. But Thucydides, he did something different. He started writing history not from the standpoint, let's say, of the general, but maybe from the standpoint of the grunt who's out there in the trench, who sees history a little bit differently than those who are in lace and fine linens. So then, to me, one of the fears against critical race theory has to do with the telling of history from the bottom up, because that's really what we're talking about here, isn't it? Is that these white supremacists don't want history to be told the way that Howard Zinn was talking about it. That is, let's tell history from the standpoint of the Arawak Indians that were massacred by Christopher Columbus. Or let's tell history from the standpoint of the West Africans who were in the bottom of a ship during a Middle Passage. Or let's tell history from the standpoint of the Apache Indians who had their land stolen first by the Spanish and then by the Americans. So then, when we think of critical race theory, to me, as I kind of like stir up the pot for our speakers to get ready to jump in on this, we are led to believe by the conservatives who critique critical race theory that critical race theory is something new. Well, what's new is that we now have a label for it, but it's something that's been going on for a long time. I mean, when you think of Frederick Douglass, when he said, "What is the 4th of July to the Negro slave?" he was looking at the United States and examining its history from a critical race theory lens. When W.E.B. Du Bois in The Souls of the Black Folk said that the problem of the 20th century is a problem of the color line, that was from a critical race theory lens. When Elijah Muhammad, after being in the South all of his life and then being a minister, a Baptist minister, and then a Muslim minister, when he said that the white man is a devil, he even was employing a critical race theory on the situation. Martin Delaney and Henry Harlan Garnett, too. So critical race theory is a looking at history from the bottom up, not the top down. And so then if education is a human right, then what are we to say when history and critical race theory are being attacked? Is that not, in fact, an attack on human rights? And we'll go again. I'm going to ask you, Kelly, to go with that first, and then Michael, and then Ken. We'll kind of reverse the order of the panel from before.
Ooh. I don't want to go first. Yeah. Oh, pardon?
I said that's what they all say.
Yeah, I think it has to be. I think the case is really clear that, and I think that's just, to me, Bree Newsom said something on Twitter that just really stuck with me, which was that white supremacy is so illogical. It's almost like when we're trying to show how illogical it is, it's like we're just yelling into the wind. And she was, I think, saying this after the insurrection. I think that's what it was. But it's just like, to me, what I've learned as a white person is like, it being in this work of undoing racism for just a short period of time, last 8 or so years, is just like, as a white person who's not at the top of the pyramid, it's like I'm constantly being indoctrinated to view something that Black people and other people of color at the bottom are pushing forward as a threat, even though it's actually super liberatory to me. And so what hurts me so deeply is to like see my white kin attacking critical race theory, thinking that it's something that's threatening to them. Some of them actually, like, if you sat with some critical race theory for a moment, you would see that it's an invitation into practicing your own freedom, and that you actually could figure out how to be freer if you sat with this. At least, I remember the first time I went to a People's Institute for Survival and Beyond training and kind of experienced some of what Reverend Billings was just talking about, of like learning from communities of color who've been doing this work, like you said, Reverend Buford, for so long, way before it had a name, critical race theory, and when I sat there, it really, I'm not sure if I'm a Christian anymore, but the imagery that happens for me is it really truly felt like scales were falling from my eyes as I sat with the real history of this country and the real history of global colonialism and how that impacts me as a white woman too, and makes me feel like, well, if I can just cozy up to people at the top of the pyramid, maybe I'll be safe, when actually it's killing my soul. As Ruby Sales says, white supremacy is whiteness is soul murder. And that's been my experience with whiteness. And so to me, critical race theory is an important essential aspect of our human education and our right to know it, which is clearly why they're attacking it, because they know that this is a liberating force of history and truth telling. The other thing I still stick with, even though I'm not sure I'm a Christian anymore, is when Jesus said, the truth will set you free. I just really believe that. And I think that's why folks are trying to squash this truth telling. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Washington, if education is a human right, what would we call attacks on the teaching of history and critical race theory with respect to attacks on human rights?
The current attacks on teaching history, if allowed to prevail, will socialize the next generation of citizens to discount people of color's struggle for human rights as not just un-American, but a threat to the democratic way of life. From this point of view, when people threaten democracy, they are unworthy of citizenship and should become targets of voter suppression initiatives. These voting rights attacks are both obvious and subliminal. They are overt and covert attempts to devalue the cultures of people of color as unworthy stakeholders in the American political arena. For example, the recent attacks on critical race theory is a subterfuge orchestrated by neo-segregationists to portray the white race as having superior morality and no culpability in the inhumane treatment of people of color. This includes, for the most part, the populations of people from the Western Hemisphere, the Pacific Islands, Asia, and Africa. If public education can be relied upon to glorify the atrocities committed by whites against the remainder of the world's people, then the blatant methods of suppressing votes will be less difficult to achieve. Under these circumstances, the public schools curriculum function as a covert or subliminal agent to condition future citizens to accept and rationalize the disfranchisement of citizens of color. The attacks on critical race theory is a subterfuge because critical race theory is not likely to be taught in the public schools. It is the work of progressive legal scholars seeking to address the role of racism in the law and working to eliminate it. It is a field of inquiry in the legal field and in other areas of scholarship, but not a course of study in the public schools. The name became popular among the neo-segregationists after the September 4, 2020 memo issued on training in the federal government from President Trump's Office of Management and Budget. The memo was written to stop government branch agencies from spending millions of dollars of taxpayers' money on, in their words, quote, training government workers to believe divisive anti-American propaganda, end of quote. Because critical race theory was specifically targeted in the memo, it has become the buzzword for legislators who seek to pass white supremacy laws that suppress the voting rights of black people and people of color. The blatant attempts by legislators to disfranchise citizens of color by suppressing their right to vote are reinforced by the subliminal methods used in America's classrooms that condition students to glorify whites' victories over non-white people and to devalue the rights of human beings. One method employed to achieve this end is the use of linguistic racism. By linguistic racism, we mean the use of words to perpetuate the dominance or hegemony of one race over others. In this context, words that otherwise seem innocuous, like the word classical, may be used to deny people of color the historical memory of their culture's glorious achievements. We tend to think of the classical civilizations as those of ancient Greece and Rome. We can readily identify Bach, Mozart, and Beethoven as classical composers. Because the word classical is far too often used only in reference to Europeans, the word is internalized as being a white thing only, and rarely, if ever, is thought given to the fact that classical traditions exist among people throughout the world, and not just Europe. No one can deny that Olmec, Mayan, Aztec, and Incan societies were classical cultures in the Western Hemisphere, or that classical culture of ancient China significantly influenced the continent of Asia and the islands of Asia. Neither will historians deny that Kush and Egypt represent classical civilizations of Africa. Yet, the educational process in the United States falls short on training future citizens to acknowledge as equals the classical contributions of other cultures to humanity. The passage of white supremacy laws is predicated on the idea that whites are superior because they are more civilized than people with no classical civilizations. The effective use of linguistic racism does more than transmit the disappreciation of non-European cultures. It also functions to render historically insignificant the very humanity of cultures of color. This is often accomplished by the inconsistent use of seemingly innocuous words like explorer, settler, and pioneer. When the militaristic interactions by whites result in the decimation of huge populations of native people and the confiscation of their lands, from the white perspective, it was because of the success of the adventurous white explorers, brave pioneers, and hard-working white settlers. But when white or European governments fall prey to powerful militaristic nations, the language is altered to convey a more realistic account of the aggressiveness of the interactions. For example, in the United States, it is commonly believed that World War II began on December 7th, 1941, when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In this case, the word attacked is appropriately used and not the word explored, even though the nature of the militaristic interactions did not differ qualitatively from such so-called explorers as Cortez, Pizarro, or Sir Jeffrey Amherst, who advocated the use of smallpox blankets to reduce the population of Native Americans. It is generally accepted as a correct response that World War II began after Hitler's September 1st, 1939 invasion, not settlement of Poland, but invasion of Poland. But these Eurocentric renditions of the beginning of the war do not account for the thousands of Asian lives lost in Manchuria and Shanghai in 1931 and 1932 at the hands of a militaristic government that would withdraw from the League of Nations and become a member of the Axis powers. Neither do these interpretations regard the 1935 attack on the Africans in Ethiopia by fascist Italy under Mussolini as the beginning of World War II, even though aerial bombardment, flamethrowers, poisonous gas, and concentration camps were all employed. It is only when whites were attacked that World War II officially began, and the language of invasion was appropriately used to convey the inhumanity of the interactions. But even then, the deaths of thousands of Asians and Africans that signaled the emergence of the worldwide conflict remain unworthy of holding the official status of having sacrificed the first casualties of World War II. Because of the prevalence of this Eurocentric interpretation of history, it is imperative that people of color and that the anti-racist movement prevent the passage of white supremacist laws, and if passed, white supremacist laws that if passed will go further than just misrepresenting people of color in history books. Their victory makes legitimate the disfranchisement of entire districts and jurisdictions of poor and working class people. People of color must therefore emulate the great citizens of Georgia who were vigilant and determined to make their votes count. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Washington. Reggie, what are your thoughts on that? We already talked about education as a human right. Well, what about that human right being attacked by white supremacy laws and white privilege laws, as Dr. Washington's just talked about?
Well, he's spot on. the language that is used to describe the actions of Europeans is always euphemistic. It's always spoken of in polite or gentle terms, even when the most gross brutality occurs. And the only time they get annoyed is when we start using language that precisely describes how they're behaving. White fragility, fear. And I think that's where the locus of the movement has to come. It's not my problem as a person of color. It's the problem of folk who are Eurocentric and think they have to hold on to this litany of brutalization and the way they look at things, and then have to always come back and brutalize even more when it's not necessary. It's not necessary. Again, I want to keep it simple. For years, I managed police officers, and it was never the African American officer, or the white female officer, or the Latino male officer or female officer, or the Asian male or Asian female officer. It was always the white male officer that had to be more brutal, more forceful, quick to bring out their baton or weapon. And when I was a sergeant, I said, calm down. And what is it? Where does this fear come from? That you think that, in order for you to survive, you got to wipe out everything. And it's not necessary. It's a paranoia. It's a psychological problem. And it's fear-based. And so I can't fix it for them. No matter how you describe it to them, they just reject it. We don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear anything about critical race theory, because it's just saying, look, we're not looking at the world from your perspective. We're looking at the world from our perspective. And we have a perspective. So, you're saying that we're the oppressors. Well, how can you deny that? How can you deny it? All 7 continents. How can you deny it? Make your case of denying it, and then the litany of lies about everything that you have done, as if no one else has achieved or produced anything to this human race that was beneficial to this human race. I mean, it's almost childish and very petty. So, it's the language. It's words that they use. I'll end with this. And when we take their words, or when we develop our own words, and we're very good at that, I'm speaking about African Americans, we bring up our own language. We reject the dominant language. We use our own language, and we turn it into money. That's all hip hop is. We use our own definitions and etc. Then they take it and then turn it into something that they think has to be evil. Black Lives Matters. What is so harmful about that? We can't even think of Black Lives Mattering. It has to be all lives mattering. And then they get this hyper emotionalism over it. It's really a psychological problem.
Thank you, Brother Reggie. Let me just make some last remarks, and I think that Dr. Washington will have some last remarks too as we talk about what we want to do from here, because we want to do this sessions like this at least 2 more times before the year is over, and we can have a little bit of discussion on that. But let me first of all thank everyone that participated in this conversation, and that you were patient with us here in the studio for the various technical difficulties that held us up. So I apologize to everyone for this taking a little more time than we anticipated, but that's show business, so they say. So I just want to say, to wrap up, that we should know after all of these presentations that education is a human right. It should be a human right, and it should be protected as a human right. But as Dr. Washington said, there's a caution that we must have about just the concept of education. That is to say, there's the education of the state, and then there's the education of the human being. And the state has its own priorities and its own types of values where education is concerned. I'll just put it bluntly by saying that never in the history of the world, not even in Hollywood, has a people ever been taught how to be free by the people who enslaved them. That's never happened in history. I haven't even seen a movie on that where the people who enslaved you taught you then how to be free of that. There might be a few that sneak through the cracks and try to teach you how to read or whatever, or give you some bread or point you to where the North Star is. But by and large, the people who have enslaved you are not going to teach you how to be free of them. And the American history experiment is certainly a lesson in that. That being said, we should not only get the education that they provide, we should get the education that they don't provide. I used to work in the San Bruno County Jail, which is part of the city and county of San Francisco. And while I was teaching in there, in order to get these inmates, male and female, interested in education, I tried to put it in terms that they could understand, in terms of theft. And I told them that a lot of them wasted their time in school, and they wanted to know why I said that. I said because they were giving something out for free, and you didn't even take as much as you could get. And I said, and education and knowledge and information is like that. It's out there. It's free. I said, and if you really knew how valuable it was, you would be cramming it into your pockets. You would cram it into your head. You would cram it into every opening that you could cram it into, because you would understand that it's valuable. Education, unlike a car or a house, is something that if you go into debt for your education, then they can't come and repossess your education if you can't pay your student loan. Education is something as long as you have it, as long as you build on it, it appreciates. It's not like a car or a house that depreciates after you spend some money on it, but it appreciates as long as you have it. So then we ought to be about education. I liked what Rabbi Gottlieb was talking about when she was talking about education as being a survival necessity, and that's what it is. Our ancestors understood that. That's why the first things, the institutions that they opened were educational institutions. Even as they had churches, they operated educational institutions. And some of the earliest freedmen educational institutions educated both Native Americans and African Americans in those places. So then we have to value education. We have to preserve education. We should protect education as a human right and a protection of our own legacy. But also, we should not depend on the institutions that have created a school-to-prison pipeline that actually is what makes the educational system a success. The success rate of the educational system isn't in the graduation rates or even the people that go on to college, but in the predictable large amounts of black people that end up going from the school to the prison. I mean, and the educational system is successful in destroying black lives, and it's countable and measurable in its successes that way, and it's predictable from one jurisdiction to the next. Therefore, we should protect education as a human right because it's our right, and if we don't protect it, then soon we will not have it. Now, we're going to do a couple more of these talks. One is going to be on linguistic racism. As Dr. Washington alluded to earlier, we're going to be unpacking linguistic racism in these white supremacy laws, in these white privilege laws, not only in their current manifestations, but in perhaps some historical manifestations too that might not be so obvious that we labor under. And then the last session of the year, we're going to be talking about militarism as applied racism, the martial enforcement of genocidal policies. Racism can be an ideology, and is certainly a social construct. But what is it that holds that construct in place? Well, first of all, you need a language to describe it, to hold it in place. But when the people start acting up, you're going to need more than some strong words to hold them in place. You're going to need police, you're going to need military, you're going to need the border patrol, you need the martial enforcement of genocidal policies. So then in our last session, we'll be talking about that with respect to the white supremacy laws, the white privilege laws. So I want to thank you as a moderator of this very stimulating conversation and turn it back over to our host, Dr. Michael Washington, Distinguished Professor of History and all things pertaining to Black liberation at Northern Kentucky University.
Well, thank you, Reverend Buford. The voting period is around the first week of November, so we'll be thinking in terms of sometime in October, the seminar on linguistic racism, and probably after the voting, sometime in late November, early December, the militarism. That's what we're working toward having to happen. So, but this has been Afrocentricity, and until the next time, thank you. So long.